This video is a supercut of all of my coverage surrounding the Snyder Bro fandom. The first video that you're going to see is from almost an entire year ago, and it's going to lead all the way up until the release of Superman 2025. So keep that in mind as we move along. I might say in a separate video, I talked about X. Well, that's just because that was a separate video. This is a compilation of all of them for your viewing pleasure. I have chopped off the outros to all those videos to make it feel more cohesive and more like one big video, so I hope you enjoy. Superheroes. Whether you love or hate them, they've been a staple of American culture since the late 1930s. Superheroes stand for, at the bare minimum, fighting for justice in times of peril. We all have our favorite heroes, be it the classics or more recently introduced heroes, but at the end of the day, it's all just for fun and the love of the genre, right? Wrong! Well, that's how it is for a majority of casual viewers. Fans who are more invested may stand to disagree. See, there's a specific subsect of fans that cannot stand to agree to disagree, and it's causing a lot of backlash towards the genre. Today, we're going to be looking at the fandom behind DC Comics, but specifically surrounding the films of Zack Snyder. This fandom has been dubbed by many as the Snyder Bros. Now, this will probably be my most divisive video since the rise and fall of Spider-Man Lotus. So, before we get into it, I just want to make it clear, I do not hate Zack Snyder or his fans. I adore Snyder's take on Watchmen, despite the metatextual inaccuracies towards the source material. I love 300. I love Sucker Punch. In fact, Sucker Punch is one of the most underrated action movies to come out of the 2010s. This video is mainly focused around objectively psychoanalyzing the fanbase, or the Snyder Bros, rather than critiquing Snyder as a director. This isn't a hate video. This isn't me saying, look at these people enjoying themselves. Wow, let's rip on them. No, that's not what this is, I promise. So who is Zack Snyder exactly? Well, he's an American director and producer whose career really launched with his remake of Dawn of the Dead in 2004. If you follow DC films, then it's very likely that you've come across the name before, as these works tend to be his most popular and have come to be known as the Snyderverse. Zack's history with film dates back to his childhood, which he spoke on during an interview for The Hollywood Reporter in 2011, saying, "I was like a maniac. My mom bought me my Super 8 camera when I was 11. A Canon 1014 XLS. The first movie I ever shot was a stop-action Star Wars movie with my Star Wars figures." He continues to detail his early life, in which he was constantly filming and coming up with new ideas for different things to film. Zack shared that the camera allowed him to express himself in a whole new range of ways that otherwise wouldn't have been possible, which seems to be a sentiment that is echoed by many cinematographers on how they found their calling. And for Zack, the camera did call. He didn't limit himself in the types of videos that he filmed either, as much of his early career was working on music videos for various artists like ZZ Top, Lizzie Borden, and even My Chemical Romance. After the launch of Dawn of the Dead in 2004, his attention shifted from music videos and short films to feature films and the glamour of Hollywood. Zack began working on larger projects and gaining notoriety for his style and genre of films, but the most notable break in his career was during the post-production of Justice League in 2017, where Snyder had to step away from filmmaking due to the unfortunate passing of his daughter, Autumn. After the devastating passing of his daughter, Zack became involved in raising awareness for mental health and prevention. He has since returned to the film industry with more determination than ever, crediting the fans and their curiosities as one of the reasons that he even made his return in the first place, and that fan base was ready to back him at every turn upon his arrival. Now that we get an idea of the who, let's talk about his actual film history, his filmography. Even if some don't enjoy his work, Zack has had his hands in a lot of projects to various degrees. I'm not going to evaluate every single one individually, or this video would be like 10 hours long, but we're going to touch on the work that he's done with DC, as these are the films that seem to cause the most discussion within his fandom. But as a catch-all, many of his works have pretty mixed reviews right off the bat. Watchmen was very mixed upon its release, but I love it. 300 was a hit, if I remember correctly. I like that one a lot too. And Sucker Punch was trashed by critics, but that's one that I also really like. Man of Steel is a movie depicting the origin story of Superman that was released in 2013. It comes in at an astounding 2.5-hour runtime, and it takes on an edgier style that many weren't really accustomed to at the time. Sure, we had just gotten off of the Dark Knight trilogy, but this was Superman. Man of Steel was clearly directed for a more mature audience, using language, violence, and a very shiny PG-13 rating that we see throughout his movies. It also made one specific choice that was met with some criticism. Superman was very violent in this movie. There's a level of violence to be expected in these kinds of movies. Superheroes fight the bad guys. That's how it works. But the last hour of this movie can best be described as all hell breaks loose. It's a mass destruction event, flying through fuel tanks and buildings and destroying everything in their way, and the suffering caused by these actions is shown but kind of disregarded. This chaos and destruction all ends with Superman very unceremoniously snapping Zod's neck. Despite the popularity of the character, the movie was met with very mixed reviews, with some even going as far as to say that the portrayal of Superman in the movie was a betrayal of the original character and his values. I can see where they're coming from, considering the other depictions of Superman and, in turn, Clark Kent still keep true to his original love and respect for humanity as a whole. This is often depicted in the comics through seemingly mundane actions that show respect and love for all of humanity. One of my favorite examples is a comic where Superman is eating lunch with a rehabilitated convict named Glenn. At one point, this is even called out by Glenn when he's talking about a problem with his son. Superman showed nothing but respect for a man who learned the hard way, paid for his crimes, and made a better life for himself, which I think really shows a developed moral understanding that we don't really get to see, even in our everyday lives. Aside from this, in the comics, we also see him fetching lost toys for kids and making them promise that they'll always wear their seatbelt to be safe. But the most notable example of this depiction in film is Christopher Reeve's portrayal of Superman in his 4-movie saga. The first movie of this series, Superman the Movie, from 1978, was revolutionary for the time, particularly with its special effects, and it was selected for preservation by the Library of Congress's National Film Registry in 2017. It was received incredibly well with critics at the time. Joe Shuster, who co-created the character of Superman, stated that he was delighted to see Superman on the screen. "I got chills. Chris Reeve has just the right touch of humor. He really is Superman." Which is an insanely amazing review to get from the creator of the character. While some felt that the enemies in those movies were a bit overly cartoonish, it keeps the original spirit. There's a light-hearted tone in that first movie, and we don't see Superman destroying entire cities with reckless abandon. Everything, down to the way the film was written, shot, and produced, gives it a noticeably light overtone compared to Man of Steel. And I think a really specific moment showing the heart of this character is in Superman 2, the sequel, in which Lois Lane shoots Superman at point-blank range. He doesn't flinch, he doesn't get angry at all. In fact, he just kind of tilts his head and looks up as if to say, "Really?" This was an expression of Lois's courage in herself, as well as the natural curiosity of the human spirit. And in that moment, I believe his reaction and the response given to Lois really embodies what Superman is: forgiving, kind, and understanding. I'm going to be honest with you, I could literally go on for hours about the Richard Donner movies. I might make a video on that, I don't know. But, I got goosebumps just talking about that scene. It's Oh man. So we have seen Superman struggle with his identity on screen many times, and I do think that an excellent representation of this aspect of the character is the TV series Smallville. In this show, we get to see Clark as a teenager growing up in Smallville. While the show isn't as dark in theme as some of the movies and even Snyder's take, I think there's a good balance between Clark struggling with his identity in the universe and his needs to protect the citizens of the Earth. Getting back to Snyder's work now, and not talking about any other iterations of the character and just talking about it as is, I think it's important to consider the darker thematic tones and plot may be the reason as to why this audience of Zack Snyder's fans like these films so much. I think the easiest way of explaining this conflict between Snyder Bros and non-Snyder Bros is that non-Snyder Bros don't like this violent take on Superman. They don't like how Snyder depicts these characters. They don't like that Batman kills. They don't like this darker, miserable tone. Whereas the Snyder Bros love it for that, despite the comics not really having that aspect of the characters in them. Personally, I think the violence could have been toned down a bit, but this wasn't an altogether unpleasant movie for me. In fact, I love this movie. Well, I did when I first saw it. Granted, I was 11 years old at the time. I thought that if something was dark and edgy, that meant that it was automatically good. My attitude towards the film has been soured in recent years, especially after exploring the character of Superman in the realm of comic books and realizing how vastly different this take on the character was from his comic book counterpart. One aspect of the film that I still feel really conflicted about is the overbearing symbolism of Snyder's Superman being an analogy for Jesus Christ. Now, as a Catholic myself, I can sort of understand why Snyder would take this route. He very clearly views these superheroes as gods, but it just feels off to me for two reasons. One, Superman's creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, were Jewish, and his origin story in the comics is very much based off of the story of Moses, which feels weird, taking a character like this and then comparing him to Christ. And the second reason I feel iffy about this is that this same character causes like several 9/11s in this movie. The film performed well at the box office, and critically, the scores were pretty evenly split. This movie was received well enough for DC to greenlight Zack's work on another film in 2016. Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice is the second installment in his trilogy, in which we see Batman and Superman being pitted against each other by Lex Luthor, eventually fighting the reanimated mutant corpse of Zod. That's supposed to be Doomsday, but like, oh.
What the hell is even that?
Batman v Superman takes a look at a mentally crumbling Batman, a Superman acting out of desperation to save the people he loves, and an Earth that's trying to recover from the immense damage that was caused in Man of Steel. We see humanity at its most cynical, and while this may not be an unrealistic reaction based on events of our past, it sets a much darker tone for the film than you may be used to seeing in this genre, and that tone lingers throughout the end of the film. The film's greatest criticism is that while its premise could be very engaging, the execution of the plot, along with certain stylistic choices, caused it to fall flat. Many were complaining that the movie's dialogue, along with the actual fight scene between Batman and Superman, were unimpressive and underwhelming, which is something I kind of agree with. With the untimely death of Superman in the last film, Earth is now under threat by hostile extraterrestrial threats that are aware that Earth is free of the last Kryptonian. Filled with determination after Superman's sacrifice, Batman, joined now by Wonder Woman, set off to gather a team strong enough to save the Earth from being completely destroyed. They travel far and wide to eventually collect a team including the Flash, Cyborg, and Aquaman. Once they've reassembled at Batman's home, evidence is brought to light that it could be possible to reanimate Superman in a similar way that Zod is revived in the last movie. They head to Metropolis, revive Superman, and after some minor hiccups from being reanimated, they get to work defending the Earth. Once again, we see some mixed reviews on this movie, sitting firmly at a 40% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, 6.1 on IMDb, and 45% on Metacritic. With one reviewer, Brian Eggert, starting his review with, "Diverting but not engrossing, expensive but cheap looking, action-packed but not exciting, amusing but not funny." Many complained that the movie felt disingenuous. Like, a lot of this has to do with Joss Whedon, who took over after Zack Snyder had to step away from the project after the loss of his daughter. Some people argued that Whedon saved the movie from total failure in post-production, but it's worth noting that many people, myself included, enjoyed Snyder's cut of the Justice League more than the original release in 2017. In fact, I think the general consensus is that the Snyder Cut is better than the theatrical release. This could be attributed to conflicting viewpoints on how the plot should be laid out, or the fact that the 4-hour runtime of Snyder's Cut allows for more room for some plot that felt really rushed in the theatrical cut. So as I mentioned, the main point of this entire segment is to show that nearly every single film in Snyder's trilogy had mixed to negative reviews. Regardless of the movie, that's just the way it is. Objectively, these received mixed reviews from critics and audiences. As a forward, in my video talking about the Godzilla fandom, I introduced the toxicity triangle. We will be referencing that today. So specifically, I'll be talking about the polarization and the toxic tiers. In case you forgot, here's a very brief explanation of the tiers that I introduced in that video. So what is a toxic fan base? Well, to determine this, I created a pyramid of sorts. It's kind of like the food pyramid, if you're American and you remember that from back in the day. The way it works is there are 3 main tiers that determine whether or not a fan base is or isn't toxic. If a fan base makes it all the way to the top tier, then they are a toxic fan base. Due to the nature of this video, we'll be skipping over the mild negativity tier because, for the most part, a lot of people in that tier tend to be the voice of wisdom in any online discussions, as fighting breaks out pretty easily on this topic. Most of the trouble is going to come from the polarization tier. We've covered the basics, so let's get into what's happening in this fandom. Zack Snyder's fans have gained attraction for being in incredibly hostile fandom. But why is this? Well, the answer may be a bit more nuanced than we're led to believe. In the case of the DC fandom, the arguments begin between who was better, James Gunn or Zack Snyder. And they go hard. Like, really hard. Like, bringing up deceased daughters in arguments level. A lot of the explosive arguments hinge on stylistic choices, ad hominems, like personal attacks, and there's a focus on Snyder's darker perspective, making things more realistic. It's also worth establishing that when asked what he said to James Gunn when he found out that Gunn would be essentially taking over DC, Snyder told The Hollywood Reporter, "I called him and said I wish all the best for him. I told him I wanted it to work." And other reports indicate that the two, while stylistically being very different artists, are friends. A lot of this drama is genuinely just between the fans having this made-up war in their brain. It's like QAnon, but for nerds, where these two directors are pinned against each other due to a difference in taste, and one is trying to undermine the other with all these subtle little Easter eggs in their movies, when in actuality they're like two former co-workers. So we're going to stick to the polarization tier for examples of these interactions on social media for 2 reasons. One is that this is where a lot of his fans seem to sit, or at least the most outspoken ones. And the second reason is that a lot of the comments from the more toxic side of this fandom are just straight up depressing. And I'd like to keep the tone of this somewhat upbeat. Now, again, I just want to preface this again. I'm like making this clear. I don't hate Snyder. I don't hate his fan base. I obviously don't condone any of this behavior, though. It's perfectly normal and healthy to be able to not like something. And it's totally fine to like... Okay, water break. I'm like dying right now. It's perfectly normal and healthy to be able to not like something, and it's totally fine to like something. As I said in the beginning of this, there's no accounting for taste, and with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the things being posted. On X, the site formerly known as Twitter, a user posted, "Why does he, Snyder, add so much SA?" Another user, we'll call user 2, reposted with the caption, "Because Zack Snyder really hates Predators. Very strange thing to complain about." OP replied, "Just a question. I didn't complain." Which prompted user 2 to reply, "Cool. I'm sure you decided to tweet the question out instead of actually watching his movies and answering the question for yourself because you weren't being disingenuous." Which continues on for a bit longer with nothing really being said on the topic, just extended hostility. Another reply seen is, "Why is there SA on Rebel Moon? Sir, have you not seen how the villains look? They're literally space Germans from 1940. I'm not going to say the word because YouTube. What did you expect?" And another, "Because they prefer stories where you're told the evil guy is evil, but you never see them do the evil things on screen." Adding further criticism to a relatively harmless question, especially one surrounding such dark themes and, material. When presented with a question, not even phrased as a critique, and the first thought in the fandom is, "We're being attacked." That's not a healthy mentality. It's emotionally charged interactions like these that give this fandom such a bad reputation, and in turn, can reflect badly on superhero fandoms as a whole. SA is a very, very, very sensitive topic for a lot of people, so it makes sense that they would kind of be upset that that was in a movie. Not saying that it shouldn't be in movies, I'm just saying I understand why they're a little bit upset and why it's a consistent thing that keeps popping up in his movies. On X, another user posted, "Breaking, the DCU has officially cast its Joker for the untitled Batman the Brave and the Bold. Joker is to be played by none other than himself, James Gunn, because he's a effing clown," followed by hashtag fire James Gunn. Hashtag bring back Zack Snyder. Hashtag restore the Snyderverse. Another user posted, "James Gunn fans whenever we make a post," which was replied to stating, "Aren't you the guy that photoshopped Gunn in a torture scene?" And the answer was no, but they were one of the commenters that interacted with it. Under a Reddit thread titled, "What's the general consensus on the Snyderverse?" a user commented on how they felt the movies had some tonal issues, explaining, "It has some cool moments, but had some terrible tonal issues and creative choices. Joker killed Dick Grayson off screen? Boo. Batman killed a lot of people. Superman was not a beacon of hope. The whole Pa Kent tornado sucked too. Barry always felt more like Wally West. Superman died in his second movie. Most of all, the rush to catch up to what Marvel was doing, but going so far as to introduce Aquaman, Flash, and Cyborg as email attachments. All were failures due to, I'm sure, just trying to rush it." Another user underneath wrote out quite the paragraph as a reply, starting it out with, "In the Snyderverse, there were zero tonal issues, and no bad creative choices," which is a bold statement. They went on to point out every single time that opinion could have been considered hypocritical, which would have been a fine argument on its own if it wasn't clearly motivated to prove OP wrong rather than propose another side of the argument. In February, one user posted on X, "Absolute beast of a Superman. Henry Cavill's Superman was perfect in every way, with an attached image of Superman from all three of Zack's trilogy." A user replied underneath, "Good example of why this just doesn't work. He literally looks like a bad guy in all these pics. Also, he can look cool," which I don't necessarily disagree with, especially considering the way his face sits in these photos. Angry and hateful. That's not Superman. This is an interesting example of how Snyder's fans see the character versus the character's original portrayal, because we get a chance to see what his fans want out of a superhero. It's projected onto Snyder's depiction of Superman. While everybody wants something different out of these movies, I think it isn't unreasonable to say that maybe his ideas would have been better on characters of his own making, rather than being put on a character with a very different reputation. As we mentioned before, one of the co-creators of the character championed a much less dark and morally ambiguous portrayal as the perfect Superman. And while it does boil down to taste, it's it's important to keep information like that in mind. These are just some examples that I picked up when I searched his name on social media. In fact, I also didn't have to dig super far to find something that took this fandom's toxic claim to the next level. The amount of harassment that was directed at those working at Warner Bros. Increased campus-wide security due to some death threats being sent to the higher-ups from Snyder's fandom. When asked about it, Snyder didn't have much to say on the subject, instead choosing to highlight the amount of money donated to charities for unaliving as the reason his fans couldn't be bad. From The Hollywood Reporter, I'm not going to comment on the details of whether they are good or bad, whether they are toxic or bullying. That's in every chat room. It's what comes with the internet. But I do know that the work they did on some level was good. I can say for a fact that they did good. That is undeniable. While it is truly a fantastic thing to raise well over $500,000 for a charity, especially one for unaliving prevention. I'm sorry I have to keep saying that, but YouTube is so stupid. Creators, though, do need to denounce toxic behavior among their fans. Later on, an article would eventually come out that would shed some light on a different controversial aspect of the fandom, and that's botting. Up to 13% of users that tweeted #release the Snyder Cut were bots. And after an investigation was launched, this was proven to be true. The report also noted that there is an average amount of bots that you find in these specific circles, and according to the article, these numbers were well above average. According to two reports commissioned by Warner Media and recently obtained by Rolling Stone, at least 13% of the accounts that took part in the conversation about the Snyder Cut were deemed fake, well above the 3 to 5% that cyber experts say they typically see on any trending topic. When commenting about this, Snyder once again dodged the question, stating, "The truth is, it doesn't matter. The movie got made. If they were smart enough to employ bots in this thing, then they won. That movie has no business existing, and it does." He did make somewhat of a statement on his fans' behaviors during an interview with Wired. It's one of the more direct statements on his fan base that I've personally come across during my research.
Let me pull at that thread, because your name is now associated with the downsides of extreme fandom. These days, internet shorthand for aggressive bullying in fandom is like Snyder Cut fans, many of whom actually were harassing people and posting vitriol online.
Look, there's tons of toxic fans, and I don't condone that behavior, but for every toxic fan, there were legitimate and ridiculous and really incredibly dark attacks on me, my family. I'm not justifying any bad behavior, but also I'm in this conversation with this fandom, where I have tried to make the work as best I can.
On top of everything, your work is so polarizing. Nearly every article about you says something to the effect of whether you love or hate his movies. How do you make sense of that?
It's weird that people care that much, that they would hate the movies. I'm more interested in the analysis of what draws that kind of ire. The fandom has emerged in this strong way. They're not casual. I make movies with the motivation to create something for the fans where they get to care about it as much as possible. That's the sort of bargain that I've struck. I think that's the closest he's gotten to denouncing toxic behavior within his fans. He does speak on how it's affected him as well, which is an important factor to remember when we're looking at cases like these. They aren't just affecting those in online spaces. These behaviors impact the lives and reputations of creators. It's got to be sobering to have people directly ask you about your fan base's toxicity. constantly, especially when really good things can come out of these spaces, like the charity donations. There's a balance somewhere between the creator and the individual contributor in these spaces, and they both hold blame to a certain degree in these situations. So, why do we have these kinds of interactions plastered everywhere in this fandom? Well, first, I think we should take a look at superhero fandoms as a whole, because it's not an isolated group in this genre. We see an increase in toxicity within all superhero spaces, and there may be a few reasons for this phenomenon. Superheroes were initially geared towards kids during World War II. They were a great tool for keeping the American spirits high, especially in capturing patriotism in the younger generations. There were even comics made of popular superheroes at the time, depicting them fighting the opposing forces in the war, like the iconic comic book cover of Captain America punching Hitler in the face. These comics were brightly colored, somewhat upbeat, and aimed towards a younger audience, which would continue to be the target audience in this genre for many years. Many of us enjoyed these comics, and later the movies, in our youths and still today. However, eventually, people grow up, and they get to a point where they may not want to associate with things that are traditionally childish, or if they do like something that could be considered childish, they may feel the need to lash out in defense of it. The latter is less of a statement on the individual and more of a statement on the social atmosphere we've created surrounding adulthood. In reality, there's nothing wrong with liking things that may be traditionally considered childish. There's plenty of movies and shows from when I was younger that I still enjoy immensely. I'm still a goofy goober, but society hasn't always been that laid back. There are still a lot of people who criticize enjoying media typically geared towards a younger audience, and that in turn puts people on the defense right away. From where I'm standing, we all could use a hero from time to time. Stories of humans with superpowers or super strength that defend us have been around since the creation of the gods themselves. It's very human to like the idea of a superhero, and that's been proven more than once. In her thesis, Brianna Craig took a look at the psychology behind superheroes and us regular humans. She found that we tend to give superheroes the same qualities that we would assign the ideal person. When compared against results in a set of 3 studies surveying the value of certain characteristics in people, she later noted on the trustworthiness of superheroes, saying, quote, "Superheroes display dispositional signs of trust because you can judge their character through their actions and their story arc. You can see that they always tell the truth and follow up on their promises. Superheroes also display contextual signs of trustworthiness because they have a role in situations as the hero, which automatically puts them in a position to be trusted. Otherwise, who would save all of the civilians?" Another study was done on the effects of watching superhero movies on audiences, and the positive effects did outweigh the negative generally. But it is worth noting that there was an uptick in negative or aggressive behaviors, specifically in men, that are presented after consuming superhero content, as well as a decreased emotional intelligence and critical thinking skills. This could be another contributing factor, especially considering the dark tones and amount of violence that we've established are found in Snyder's work. While it's not fair to blatantly blame aggressive behaviors on any individual piece of media or stylistic choices, because each individual is, well, that, an individual with many contributing factors. It is something, though, to keep in mind when we look at these spaces. Another good resource is a book titled Are Superheroes Ourselves?, which is a collection of essays written on various aspects of the whole superhero genre and how or why they impact us psychologically. It obviously touches on the fact that we are all individuals and our unique life experiences shape the way we intake and engage with this content, but I think it offers some valuable insight into the emotions that fuel the behaviors we see in these online spaces. While this may only affect a small amount of viewers, it could also be a contributor as to why this genre is so toxic. Arguments can turn into something incredibly personal very quickly for some, especially if they feel strongly connected with the story itself. The stereotypes surrounding the genre, as well as these psychological factors, are what I believe to be the first factor that makes this fandom so charged. And really, all superhero fandoms seem to have this underlying theme in them as well. Eventually, the superhero genre adapted to include a wider audience. Over the years, we've seen this genre branch out to include older audiences in various ways, be it how the movie is shot, the dialogue, plots, etc., all with varying degrees of success. When executed correctly, these adjustments make for fantastic pieces of media, but there has to be an amount of thought put into the application of these adjustments. There's a lot to be said about bringing a character up to speed, especially ones who have been around for so long, like the Justice League, and it's been done well several times over the years. So why are Snyder's films under scrutiny so much? For starters, Snyder has admitted to going into his projects with the idea that he wants them gritty, dark, and twisted, which on its own is not necessarily good or bad, but it has to fit the tone of the narrative as well. You have to allow the story to have its own life. If you force a stylistic choice on a story, it can lead to the end product being somewhat dull and forced. For example, Tim Burton's 1989 adaptation of Batman brought him back to his darker gothic origins, which was also very well received. This was huge because, at the time, Batman and his villains were mostly up to zany mischief and joking around. I mean, before this, people really only thought of Batman as Adam West. There's room for darker tones and themes in this genre. It's been proven over and over again, but it has to be authentic. That's where the line between intention and execution lies. And that's what can make or break a project like that, especially when it's such beloved and established characters like these superheroes. While the darker tones can bring in an audience that might have otherwise not interacted with the genre, people were complaining that the movies were overall too dark thematically. It's also appropriate to consider where the line is societally when we look at the amount of violence and heartache on screen. It's important to have a certain balance, and it's important to evaluate where you stand individually. Now, for me personally, I have to have an eclectic taste in film because I can't surround myself with media that's super dark. Otherwise, I get super depressed and anxious if that's all that I'm taking in. Sure, I love some depressing movies every once in a while. Trust me, I make videos on them. But I need some goofy goober time as well. That's part of why I think it's so important to take a look at the individuals perpetrating the toxic behavior. Different types of media impact the way we view the world. In the same sense that listening to sad music can help other people when they're sad, but it can make other people feel way worse when they're not sad. Regardless of your opinion on the matter, it's clear throughout the trilogy that there's a pattern in the way Zack makes his movies. You obviously want a trilogy to have a similar vibe because it's supposed to be cohesive, but a lot of his movies are obviously stylized, especially compared to other works from that genre at the time, and that's where our second factor comes into play. One of their major talking points is the style of his movies, be it that other people are not understanding or appreciating how true to life and realistic his work is. Under one of the more tame or perhaps moderated discussions about his work, many comment on the effects used, be it positively or negatively, and overall there's a good chunk of people who felt that a lot of his work is at least mediocre and somewhat pretentious. John Esposa wrote on this subject back in 2015, saying, quote, "The problem with keeping the same filming style is that it needs to evolve with the artist, or else they will be stuck in a permanent state of uninspired arrested development. This is where Snyder currently finds himself, a slave to conventions and predictability." If you don't like one of his movies, you're likely not going to enjoy any of his movies. And these behaviors indeed spring up naturally in any fandom because there is an emotional charge to the subject. And it's also true that they shouldn't be encouraged because fan spheres are a place to enjoy the things you enjoy with your community. People do seek out these online communities as a space to connect. For some, it may be their only way to connect with people. Some are wondering if Snyder may be spurring on these behaviors by his actions. Two such people, Anastasia Salter and Mel Stanfill, wrote a book analyzing a few leading auteurs involved in cult media. and they wrote Zack his very own chapter. Though he is mentioned quite often throughout the book, a point they make very clear that I'm inclined to bring up is that he is a genuine fan of the franchise he works under. You can tell in the way he speaks on the topic during interviews that his love for the superhero genre is incredibly genuine. But that's also where things can start to go wrong. Moreover, he is fanish in another sense. Upon closer examination, it begins to seem as if Snyder is not only the purest fanboy auteur, but a startlingly comprehensive embodiment of the very worst stereotypes of the fandom. They go on to explain that the way that Snyder views his own work and the more direct way he interacts with his fans gives him a unique status in which the fandom mimics what kind of behaviors they see from the person they're following, and in a way, I do see this to be true. A brief example of this is a quote pulled from an interview with Sean O'Connell with Cinema Blend, and it's a long one, so stay with me here. I think that's sour grapes. There's really no other way to say it. We know the people who were the architects of that narrative, and it's pretty obvious what their agenda is. Those are people that I've been held back from confronting by wiser people in the room, because I'd love to get at some of these characters. Some direct conversation would be nice. Just to say, 1, you don't know shit about what you're talking about, and we can break down everything they've ever said. I can make a list. There's a few of these guys where I could just get a list of everything they've ever said that they thought was right, and I could tell them every single thing they've said is wrong. And so, in what world do you have any credibility anywhere to anyone? I would love the opportunity to just say to the world and to fandom in general who these fakers are and what should be done to them or with them. It's just a bunch of BS in regards to that toxic fandom, or it's a win for toxic fandom again. In what world does this toxic fandom raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for unaliving prevention? How is that toxic fandom? They've probably achieved more than any other fan base and done more good than any other group. So I don't understand. I would love the opportunity to just say to the world and to fandom in general who these fakers are and what should be done to them or with them. That's a statement with aggression behind it. While it may not have seemed to be a huge statement in the moment, it's an important look into how his mind is ticking, and that does have an influence in these spaces. Their shared love for Snyder and his films is what I believe drives the toxicity in this fandom, and I think it's the way Snyder uses his community specifically that has caused it to gain notoriety for its abrasiveness. In an interview for the Sunday Times, Zack admitted to riling up his fans during a charity campaign to generate more donations, saying, quote, "They've saved lives," he said, referring to the money raised for the American Foundation of Unaliving Prevention. Again, I'm sorry I have to keep saying that. That's YouTube. It sucks. That's a fact. But on the other hand, was it fun to provoke them for a clickable thing? Yes. And they were an easy target, but they continue to raise money. He knows they're an easy target. He knows they're emotionally attached to the work he does, and he openly admitted to using it. While it may have been for a good cause, does that excuse the behavior? Or does it actually solidify the theory that Salter and Stanfill were working on? When you boil it down, I really think that we're seeing a group of vulnerable people, some of whom may lack that personal connection outside of the internet, coming together for their love of a director and having his love being formed in the image of a toxic culture that's been established around the superhero genre. I also think it does not help this particular fandom that Snyder pulls a lot of criticism due to his artistic choices and certain behaviors, which can engage the emotional parts in their brains that want to defend the things they enjoy. It's almost like a persecution complex of sorts. The word fandom has gained substantial notoriety since the formation of the internet, bringing together fans of all sorts of works and allowing them to connect with others just like themselves. In many ways, this is a fantastic thing. Many, if not all, of these groups are incredibly talented, producing their own fan works of their favorite media, and it allows a sense of community that others might not have had in their daily lives. But as is with everything, this can quickly turn into a toxic environment. No matter where you stand, one thing is incredibly clear. we need to consider our emotions and attitudes when engaging with others online. There will always be toxic people in every fandom. It's the way of the world. It's up to the rest of the fans, the normal people, and the ones that are running these spaces to denounce that kind of behavior so it doesn't run rampant. Trying to respect each other's opinions online, especially when it comes to matters of taste, will result in less drama in these online spaces overall. Fandoms were made as a place of love and celebration, so let's work on keeping them that way. So I guess, is this the most toxic fandom on the internet? No, not by a long shot. Unhinged at times? Sure, but it's in the name of love and adoration towards something that they enjoy.
This fandom has achieved wonders. We've allowed ourselves to get lost. You guys are used to seeing somebody who hides behind a mask. Well, now, the people that hide behind the mask answer to me.
The whole James Gunn versus Zack Snyder fan war has been dragging on for years, but lately it feels like it's hit a new low. Ever since the new Superman movie was announced, it started picking up some attention. Some Snyder fans have been acting completely unhinged. There are claims of them trashing merchandise in stores, threads filled with conspiracy theories, and a lot of weird obsessive energy that doesn't really feel like regular movie discourse anymore. Now, I already went through the history of all of this in a previous video, so this isn't going to be a full-on breakdown. This is more of a check-in on how things have escalated since then, how certain parts of the fandom are reacting, and why it's gotten so weird lately. Most people seem excited to see what a fresh, more uplifting take on Superman could look like. Gunn's movie is aiming to bring some joy and hope back into the character, but instead of engaging with that idea, certain corners of the Snyder fandom are fully melting down.
I'll never watch Birds of Prey. Oh yeah.
Let's start with a guy who recently went semi-viral in this bizarre niche for making a Backstreet Boys parody called I Want It Zack's Way.
Snyder.
What the fuck am I watching?
He rewrote the lyrics to mourn the loss of the Snyderverse and performed it with a level of sincerity that makes it genuinely hard to tell if it's satire or an honest tribute. Either way, it's very uncomfortable to watch.
I want it Zack's way.
But what really raised some eyebrows was something that he posted not long after. He shared a photo of himself at a football game with a teenage girl and explained that outside of his wife, she's the only person he spends time with. He called her his real-life best friend. Now, I'm going to blur out her face because she's a minor and this is already towing into very strange territory, but it's worth pointing out how bizarre it is. Not just because of the age gap, but because this is what he chose to share publicly. This is the version of himself that he wants people to see. This level of parasocial sincerity is what's so off-putting. We're not just talking about someone who likes a filmmaker, we're seeing someone whose emotional world seems wrapped around the mythos of the Snyderverse and filtered into their real-life relationships and self-image. The lines between fandom identity and social isolation start to blur, and what we're left with is less of a film community and more of a coping mechanism. That's what makes it so unsettling. It's not a parody, it's the depth of the attachment. Now let's talk about the Lethal Geeks. This is a YouTube podcast account that's basically turned their entire identity into shouting about how the Snyderverse will be restored any day now. Every post is either a vague, trust the plan style update, or another recycled promise that Zack Snyder's DC plans were always meant to be a 5-part saga, and there are operatives working at Warner Brothers that are secretly waiting to finish it. It's reached the point where it starts to feel like QAnon, but for people who collect Funko Pops. And this is the account responsible for most of the ridiculous tweets in this whole saga as of late. Here's my favorite. Word for word, I promise I didn't change anything. What part is it that you don't get? That a 52-year-old man like myself does not in any way, shape, or form find this appealing. Hank, I have no desire to remember myself in the 5th grade. I get it. You're a teacher, so your bias is going to skew for your students, so I get that. What you don't get is Gunn trying to turn the entirety of DC into Marvel, thus alienating half the fan base, the adult half. The half that wants an adult conclusion to this. Let's break this down. First of all, this guy is 52 years old, and he's arguing on Twitter with strangers about superhero aesthetics, like it's life or death. That alone should be enough to give you pause. Then he insists that enjoying anything remotely hopeful or child-friendly is some kind of personal regression. He uses the 5th grade as shorthand for weakness. He even throws shade at the guy he's replying to, blaming his profession as a teacher for why he might like a version of Superman that isn't dark and brooding. And the part that really seals it is when he says Gunn is alienating the adult half of the fan base. He capitalizes it like it's a movement. Like, if you don't want Superman to be miserable, then you must not be a grown-up. It's a rant that says way more about his self-image than it does about the actual movie. This guy doesn't want a story, he wants validation. From there, the tweets from other accounts only get worse. There's one from someone named Serena Olvido who tweeted out, "What an effing downgrade from Henry Cavill's legendary Man of Steel to this ridiculous David's corny sweat broccoli super flop. I will remember you when that disgusting movie will super flop and will be buried on Mac service just a few days after hahaha F low Sir MF Guntard." The entire post reads like a meltdown typed out mid-temper tantrum. There's no logic, just emojis, rage, and the word flop being hurled around like it's an argument. They don't ever explain what they dislike about Cornsweat's take, or even what they value in Cavill's. It's just noise. Then there's this tweet where someone claims that they bought the last Superman toy at Walmart, saw a child crying about it, and decided to laugh and destroy the toy in front of him because the kid was a Gunn fan. It's a fantasy. It didn't happen. But the fact that the poster wants it to feel real is telling. That's the world they want to live in, one where humiliating a child makes you the hero. Finally, there's a post from 2 grown men standing in a yard doing construction work. Whilst you James Gunn fans are sucking on your mom's tit and whining about Superman AI art, real men are doing man stuff. One of them is wearing a Superman shirt, and the caption is all about how real men don't cry about AI art like James Gunn fans. Instead, they build things. It's an odd flex, like they're literally just doing manual labor and using that as a reason for why their opinion on superhero movies is more valid. That's how far out of hand this has all gotten. They turned yard work into a culture war. The truth is, you don't need to argue with these people. You don't have to correct them, quote tweet them, or try to win them over. That only feeds the cycle. The smartest thing you can do is mute, block, and move on. It helps to point out when something's clearly off, especially if it's crossing lines or flooding public conversations, but after that, there's just no value in staying locked into it. Letting this stuff live rent-free in your head won't change their minds. It'll just exhaust yours. What's actually happening here has less to do with movies and more to do with identity. A lot of these people grew up loving superheroes, but somewhere along the way, they started to feel embarrassed by that. Maybe it was pressure from peers, maybe it was a fear of being seen as childish, or maybe they just never learned how to enjoy something without needing to be validated by others. So when Snyder came along and made these stories darker, more intense, and wrapped them in the language of epic myth, it gave them something to hold on to. It made the genre feel serious. It gave them permission to still care. But now that DC is shifting towards something a little brighter, something more emotionally open and sincere, that sense of safety is gone. They feel like they're losing the version of these characters that help them feel less self-conscious. So instead of adapting, they double down. They mock anything optimistic, they lash out at actors, directors, and they cling to whatever makes their taste feel more adult, even if that word doesn't mean anything in this context. This behavior doesn't come from a place of strength, it comes from insecurity, and if you try to meet it head-on with logic or empathy, you'll only get pulled into the performance. You're not obligated to fix it, you're allowed to walk away. But that's just my theory. In 2017, Justice League was released in a compromised state after Zack Snyder stepped away from the project and Joss Whedon was brought in to finish it. What followed was some of the most organized and persistent fan campaigns in modern internet history. The #ReleaseTheSnyderCut movement began as a grassroots effort to restore Snyder's original vision, what many believed was a darker, more coherent version of the film that had been buried by studio interference. The subreddit r/SnyderCut became the central hub for that push, uniting fans around a clear and simple goal: let Zack finish what he started. Against all odds, it worked. In 2021, Zack Snyder's Justice League premiered on HBO Max, running 4 hours long and fully embracing the tone and structure that Snyder had envisioned from the beginning. It was an unprecedented win for the online fandom. The campaign had delivered real results, proving that organized digital pressure could sway a major studio. But in 2025, 4 years later, with James Gunn preparing to launch an entirely new DC universe and Superman just days from release, the subreddit still hasn't moved on. What was once a space for rallying around a cause has turned into something else. A forum suspended in time, clinging to a version of the franchise that is dead and no longer exists. The posts now aren't about celebration or appreciation. They're about sabotage, conspiracies, and control. To me, this is the saddest subreddit on the entire internet, and that's saying a lot. The current state of r/Snyder Cut is best summed up by a recent post calling for an organized sabotage of Superman 2025. What makes this post most notable isn't the strategy being proposed, but the fact that James Gunn actually took the time to respond to it. His reply didn't defend the movie or challenge the post directly, instead he just mocked it. That shift in tone from public pressure to open dismissal really shows how far the subreddit has fallen from its peak influence. The title of this post is "Stand Up and Fight for the Snyderverse" on July 11th, and it's by a user named TrickyFood5757. It says, "Fight for our Snyderverse on the imposter Superman release day. Here's what we can do to make a difference. 1. Post spoilers everywhere. People are less likely to see or enjoy the movie if it's already spoiled. 2. Leave bad ratings on review sites. We know for sure gun bots will post fake positive reviews, so we must let people know the truth and balance the bias out with realistic scores. 3. Reserve tickets online but don't complete the purchase. By selecting and reserving tickets, it gets taken out of the pool for a period of time, which means this has a chance of stopping gun bots from buying tickets. Gunn fired the first shot and killed the Snyderverse, and here's our chance to take the fight back to him. Hashtag restore the Snyderverse. Hashtag if we can't have our Superman, no one can." James Gunn responded to this by saying, "Lol, I think we'll survive. I'm not sure the 8 people that listen to that guy, I'm going out on a limb and guess it's a guy, are going to impact the course of events." The tactics listed in this subreddit post reflect a complete misunderstanding of how audiences engage with blockbuster films. Spoilers and review bombs don't derail a release. Like, there are so many dog shit movies that make a ton of money at the box office. Like, that's just how it is. Even if the reviews are negative, like, people really don't care that much. Coordinated ticket hoarding doesn't create financial damage in any meaningful way. Like, that's just not how buying tickets online work. I have to assume a caveman wrote this because any normal person just knows that that's not how online ticket sales work. These are attempts to feel in control of a situation that moved on without them. They're a symptom of a group that no longer has any clear goals or things to strive for beyond the very big blanket goal of restore the Snyderverse. It's also funny to me how, like, the tone of the post frames Gunn as this hostile figure, as if directing a reboot amounts to personal sabotage and a personal attack on this guy. He refers to him as someone who fired the first shot, and recasts a business decision as an act of war. This level of dramatization suggests that some of these users aren't defending a creative vision anymore, they're defending an identity that has no place in the current direction of DC.
But wait, there's more!
Now, this post actually got the attention of the mods on r/Snyder Cut, and I have my own issues with the mods on here, and I will talk about that later in the video, but for now, I just wanted to read out the statement that they put out, just to kind of show how they reacted to this entire situation. Here's the post. It says, "Statement from our staff about the recent post getting social media attention. Over the weekend, someone made a post on this subreddit suggesting that people do dishonest and questionable things with respect to an upcoming movie's release. The post was made early on the morning of Saturday, June 14th at 2:10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time by an infrequent poster to the sub. It was seen and removed by one of our moderators about 2 hours later, before 4:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The post had garnered few replies and 0 upvotes, with no one else endorsing what it said. We later learned this post was screenshotted and shown on other social media platforms. We deleted it long before we knew that had happened. Our staff never approved that post and does not endorse what it said. This is a public sub, where posts do not have to be pre-approved. The mere appearance of a post on our sub does not represent any endorsement by us. Our moderators delete posts after they are made if they violate any of our policies or Reddit's policies. There was never any question that this post violated our policies, both explicitly and needed to be immediately removed. This post wasn't so much controversial as it was universally disapproved of. We support everyone's right to vote with their wallets by choosing not to see a movie, but we do not support any dishonesty or manipulation aimed at stopping someone else from choosing to see a movie. The link to the original removed post is here, where anyone can confirm that we removed it, as well as the time it was removed. Using the mouse to hover over the date timestamp on the desktop version of Reddit shows the exact time our comment confirming the removal was made. Here's a post by a user named TheDramaKing04, and the post goes as follows. Is James Gunn sabotaging Matt Reeves' Batman, so he has to choose between merging both universes or having his projects cancelled? To me, this post reads like fanfiction mixed with corporate espionage. It suggests that James Gunn is playing 4D chess to force Matt Reeves, who is a critically acclaimed filmmaker who's made one of the most successful recent Batman films, into submission. And it's not framed as like speculation, but instead suspicion. It's the perfect example of how parts of the Snyder fandom have drifted away from just liking a filmmaker's vision and into QAnon style logic where every delay or creative decision is part of a sabotage plot. Instead of just confronting and dealing with the fact that WB has no plans whatsoever to restore the Snyderverse, they invent narratives where James Gunn is actively destroying rival projects like he's a James Bond villain. But to me, what's more interesting than this post is how revealing the comments section is. Nearly every single reply is deleted, and the mod team swoops in repeatedly. Removed for trolling or mocking the sub. Removed for being off topic. Removed for being a meta post. This is a place where even questioning the narrative is treated like heresy.
Heresy!
Any outside commentary, even if it is respectful or satirical, is scrubbed immediately. It's, at this point, not even a discussion forum, it's a purity test. Another post by user Dark Atheris is titled Wake Up, and it's a meme where the top panel is Superman and Crypto, and it says they feed us poison. The middle is the Fantastic Four, and it says so we buy their cures, and the bottom panel shows Zack Snyder's Justice League villains, and it says while they suppress our medicine. The meme is unintentionally hilarious, and part of me thinks it's very much satire, but if it isn't, it's still hilarious. It repurposes classic Big Pharma conspiracy rhetoric, the kind of stuff you'd see on a Facebook anti-vax group, and it applies to superhero movies. The message is clear. Zack Snyder's work is the medicine, and everything else is a lie. Marvel is poison. Gunn's Superman is poison. Reeves' Batman, I think poison. Like, Snyder fans have started to kind of like adopt the Batman into their like whole Snyderverse thing for some reason. I don't know. It's really confusing, but they're shifting the goalposts, and the Snyder Cut is the cure that they don't want you to have. It's the kind of post that you would expect to see in a satire subreddit like r/DC Comics Circle Jerk or something, but here it's pinned as a semi-ironic warning, I think. And once again, when users try to push back, the mods have to step in. Removed for being negative about Zack Snyder. Not off topic, not abusive, just not sufficiently reverent. This is a subreddit where objectivity is a bannable offense, and if you don't worship the altar of Snyder, you're not welcome. And that, to me, is exactly why this community has become culturally irrelevant. They're not here to talk about film anymore, they're here to preserve a myth. Here's a post by user DarkTower41, and it says, "Why a weaker Superman? Emasculating Superman for political correctness? Pandering to toxic nostalgia fandom gone wrong, or a torture porn of Superman by James Gunn? Love it or hate it, but from all the new trailers of Superman, one can't deny that this Superman seemed to be getting a good beating from everyone, including his own dog. This Superman seems to be most laughably weakest Superman we have ever seen. Has Gunn nerfed him to Kingdom Come in a desperate act to humanize him, physically and emotionally to please the nitpicky fans who used to complain about Superman being too much godlike in the Snyder movies? Has pandering to these hypocritical, toxic, and nostalgic-driven fans and the blind bandwagoning, unimaginative fans that follow him compromised James Gunn's Superman into super meh? Or is this another Hollywood's attempt in emasculating and ruining another strong heterosexual masculine male character like Superman for present political correction movement? Or is this James Gunn being James Gunn and making a PG-13 softcore torture porn of Superman?"
Who the fuck starts a conversation like that? I just sat down.
In a follow-up post with even more broken English, Dark Tower 41 again posted about this bizarre complaint by stating, "Why are James Gunn and WB Studios deliberately emasculating the new Superman visually, physically, and emotionally? It's crazy that David Cornsweet is 6'4", but James Gunn has made him look physically smaller and weaker than Henry Cavill, who is 6'1". Even his character Superman, known for his cool and calm mannerisms, seems emotionally, mentally weak and immature when facing basic questions from his lover, Lois Lane. Visually, his costume comes off as cheap and almost as a half-decent cosplay costume that needs work. Even his posture when he crashes on the ground, his body posture is silly and comical compared to Henry's Superman. But why? For a few silly laughs? Is he Superman or the silly plastic man? For a new Superman that's supposed to be brighter and hopefully, he hardly smiles, an endless criticism which Henry's Superman faced till today. But when in reality and fact-checked, it appears that even Gunn's Superman fails to crack a smile in certain scenes. Is Hollywood emasculating the symbol of male masculinity, strong alpha male characters to please the ever-changing woke social culture, woke culture? Or is James Gunn's inability to write a mature, sensible movie without his usual silly and goofy writing on a masculine character like Superman being reflected here and is coming off as beta male Superman?
You're a stupid dumbass.
These posts frame James Gunn's Superman not as creative reinterpretation, but as political and cultural offense. The user treats the character as a fixed standard of masculine strength and reacts strongly to any signs of vulnerability, humor, or emotional openness. Because, men aren't allowed to be vulnerable or funny or be emotionally open. The focus is not on story direction or cinematic choices, but on the idea that Superman, in a movie that hasn't been released yet, has been downgraded from an ideal into something less powerful and less serious. The tone is accusatory, with Gunn portrayed as someone who deliberately weakened the character to please outside groups. The fixation on David Cornsweet's height compared to Henry Cavill's just shows how superficial these concerns really are. The idea that Gunn somehow made a taller actor look smaller is not based on visual reality, but just how it works in the movie. Like, do you want Lois Lane to be at his chest when they're talking face to face? Like they did this with Thor and Natalie Portman, and you don't see this guy complaining. The fact that posture and costume details are used to support the argument shows how much of the concern is rooted in surface level presentation rather than the actual material present in the film. What really drives the outrage is the fear that Superman is being humanized at the cost of traditional masculinity. Because again, Superman never acts like a human. He has to be stoic at all times. The poster repeatedly describes the character as being weak, mentally immature, and emasculated, particularly in the emotional scenes with Lois Lane. Any sign of self-doubt or emotional vulnerability is treated as evidence that the character has been corrupted. Because again, Henry Cavill was never emotional or vulnerable around Lois Lane. Surely that's never been a thing that ever happened in his movies. Or even in the comics. Superman has never been comforted by Wonder Woman and break down sobbing. That's never happened before, guys. This is only a James Gunn thing. The user just assumes that it reflects a wider political agenda from James Gunn, who's accused of appeasing the woke culture and betraying what the poster sees as Superman's rightful identity as an Andrew Tate alpha male figure.
I like your Andrew Tate costume.
Don't fucking talk to me, idiot.
The underlying flaw, of course, in this line of thinking is the belief that masculinity and emotional depth cannot coexist. This is contradicted by not just James Gunn's upcoming portrayal, but by decades of Superman canon. Superman has had moments where he expresses grief, frustration, love, and self-doubt. He mourns, he fails, and he questions himself. These emotional moments do not diminish his strength. They give it context. The idea that a Superman who cries or takes a beating is somehow less masculine ignores what the character has always been about. Superman's power is not defined by how invincible he is, but it's by how he chooses to carry the weight of that power. He uses it for good, and for the good of humanity. In order to understand humanity, you have to be human, and I would go as far as to argue that Superman is very human. In fact, that's what makes Superman so great. These posts don't function as film criticism. Instead, they use the language of cultural grievance and culture war bullshit to push the idea that the new Superman fails because he doesn't conform to a rigid, outdated ideal of strength. In place of nuance, the poster builds a conspiracy where studio decisions are guided entirely by ideology. Has that happened in the past? Of course, I'm not denying that. But the result is not an analysis of Superman's role in storytelling, but a personal reaction to the loss of a character who once served as a symbolic protector of a worldview. What emerges is less about the film itself and more about how this audience's processes change, softness, and difference. Recently, James Gunn made some comments addressing these concerns. He stated, quote, "I see the online things, who would beat whom, Homelander or Superman or fucking whatever," and I'm like, this is the fucking stupidest fucking conversation. So then, whoever would win this fight means they're the best? Because I'll go out and write Godman, who can destroy you with a wink, but I didn't want a Superman who could punch planets, so he's a little less powerful. As someone who hates power scaling and even recently made a video about how it's anti-art, shameless plug, go and check that out, I think this is the best way to address Superman as a character from a writer's perspective. Gunn's response cuts through a conversation that has unfortunately dominated fandoms for years, one that treats characters less like people and more like statistics on a trading card. The idea that a character's value hinges on how powerful they are in combat strips away everything that makes stories matter. Superman's appeal has never been rooted in how many planets he can punch. It's in the choices he makes, the responsibility he carries, and the emotional cost of his role. Gunn's decision to scale back Superman's power is not a downgrade, but a narrative tool that upgrades the character. It allows Superman to struggle and to grow and to face situations where strength alone isn't the answer. This approach rehumanizes Superman, and for a character who is often misunderstood as being a god or a symbol of perfection, giving him room to be imperfect is what brings him back to life. Reddit user Spock Yoda made the following post on the Snyder Cut subreddit stating, "Can someone just use Google VEO3 and create Snyder's Justice League 2 and 3 for us? Is that too much to ask for? Maybe give us the Batflick movie in VEO3 as a bonus so I can die happy." In my opinion, this shows how far some fans are willing to go to revive the Snyderverse, even if it means using tools that were never designed for that purpose. AI video generators like VEO3 can create short clips, but they are nowhere near capable of producing full-length feature films with characters, performances, and structure that makes sense. Beyond the technical limitations, the legal issues are more than substantial. Generating entire films based on DC characters with their likenesses and storylines without studio approval would violate copyright law. The fact I even need to explain this is insane. Major studios are already suing companies like Midjourney and Stability AI for training on their content. Using those same tools to recreate Snyder's films would fall into the same category of unauthorized use. The desire to see these stories continued is understandable, but AI is not a loophole. It doesn't solve the rights issues, and it doesn't replace the creative labor that made these films possible in the first place. Some fans continue to hold out hope that Netflix could acquire the rights to Snyder's version of the DC universe, but this outcome is extremely unlikely. Rebel Moon, Snyder's latest project, was very poorly received and underperformed for Netflix despite a major marketing push. The financial and critical failure of that series weakens any argument for giving Snyder more high-budget IP. On top of that, most of the original cast is either uninterested or unavailable. Henry Cavill has moved on, Ray Fisher has publicly distanced himself from Warner Brothers, and Ben Affleck has shown no interest in returning for the role. Ezra Miller remains a legal and PR liability, and Gal Gadot's public support for Israel has made her a controversial figure that many studios would rather not involve in high-profile projects right now. Jason Momoa is being Lobo, and that looks fucking awesome, so I'm cool with that. Even if Netflix wanted to pursue it, the cost of licensing DC's characters would be enormous. Warner Brothers has made it clear they are moving forward with James Gunn's reboot, and have very little incentive to let a competing studio revive a discarded continuity. The logistics, cast, budget, and brand alignment all point in the same direction. The Snyderverse is over, and no major platform is in a position to bring it back. The most realistic path forward for fans who still care deeply about Snyder's vision would be to push for a comic continuation. I would love to see this. DC has precedent for this. Batman 89 picked up right where the Burton films left off, and it gave fans closure through a format that respects the original tone and direction without the financial burden of film production. A well-written comic series could allow Snyder or his collaborators to explore their planned storylines in a controlled, affordable medium. It would not require securing actors or negotiating studio deals or overcoming logistical barriers tied to live action. Snyder clearly has a love for Alex Ross, one of my all-time favorite comic artists, and I personally would love to see them team up to make a Snyderverse continuation where it's Justice League 2 and 3, maybe even a Batfleck thing, and it's done in that style with Alex Ross doing either cover art or doing the whole art for the stories. That would be incredible, and I would love that personally. If Snyder fans redirected their efforts toward advocating for a comic continuation, they might actually have a tangible shot at seeing the rest of the story told in a form that preserves what they loved about it in the first place, rather than just trashing the current output of DC in hopes that the film bombs and Gunn decides to just restore the Snyderverse anyways, which is not happening. People have said that I'm a James Gunn fanboy and that I hate Zack Snyder, but that's not really true. I love DC and I love the characters and the comics, and to me, I just want to support whatever output DC decides to go with. If it sucks, it sucks. I'll call it out. But I just think that, relying too much on the past and wishing they could bring it back is just a waste of time. It really is. And so I have to ask then, is this the natural end of all fan campaigns? The Snyder Cut subreddit began as a focused movement with a clear goal. It succeeded, against all odds, in getting Zack Snyder's Justice League released. But once that goal was met, the energy really just fractured and disappeared. What remains is a community that's defined less by advocacy and more by fixation. The original purpose has faded, and now it's replaced by conspiracy and gatekeeping and complete disillusionment. To me, this subreddit shows how easily fan movements can shift from collective action to ideological shitholes. What began as a push for creative recognition became a closed system where criticism is banned, outside perspectives are dismissed, and reality is constantly reframed to keep hope alive. The language has changed from support to resentment, and the conversation has drifted far from filmmaking and into personal identity, culture wars, and control. It's fair to feel some sympathy for these people. They built a connection with these characters and this director's vision, but it's also worth asking whether that attachment has been allowed to harden into something unhealthy. When fandom turns into isolation, when every new creative direction is seen as an attack, and when technology or sabotage are viewed as solutions, concern becomes the more honest response. The Snyderverse isn't coming back, but something deeper is being held on to, and that's what this really sad subreddit reveals. Probably the most distasteful thing a director's ever said recently. What a way to dehumanize Indian people because the vocal minority isn't gassing up your studio-mandated film. High time James Gunn's Diaper Man should be banned from India, as him and his fan base have been constantly racist towards Indians. Notice how 90% of comic book Twitter criticized Gunn's racism towards Indians, but Gunnites praised him in the name of he's not wrong. DC Studios, currently run by James Gunn and Peter Safran, has been repeatedly targeting India's sovereignty and its citizens through their movies, interviews, and fandom. Here's a thread exposing their hateful propaganda against India. Online outrage has exploded over a comment that James Gunn made recently in response to a question about internet hate that was kinda sorta, him responding to Snyder Bros. Now, instead of hearing it from me, here's what James Gunn himself actually said in full with all the context presented.
And obviously you're active online. We've seen what you've had to deal with from time to time.
That's right. A couple little things
here and there. Was any of that infusing in here cathartic for you, or why did you want to incorporate Superman's responses that he has towards online criticism?
Well, obviously I relate. Obviously I relate to that. I do tune out most of social media, but every once in a while there'll be somebody who'll say something. It's always the weirdest stuff. It's never what you expect. Mm-hmm. Some weird thing, and I go, God, that guy, and then I go, I think I might be getting upset about something a 12-year-old in India is saying. You know what I mean? I'm like, let it go. But I think that was really about, the whole scene, in fact, is about focusing on the personal human side of Clark and being able to see who he is in an interior way. And he is one of the world's best guys. He's so kind. He's always looking out for people in need, but he's not perfect. He's flawed.
Any normal, rational person should know that this quote is not racist, it's not derogatory. Instead, it's James Gunn just simply using a broad metaphor for saying, hey, I should not worry about someone that's halfway across the world and what they think of me. Despite this, fans, and I should say they aren't really DC fans, these are more of the Snyder cultists that I've been talking about for a while, they have decided to weaponize this and use it as a narrative of sorts that James Gunn is a racist. We're going to go through the Snyder fan reactions, the Gunn fan reactions, and then sort of like your everyday normal people, and try to find some middle ground in all of this. I think the first thing I want to kind of talk about is how a lot of people have been saying that this comment in particular is a direct attack on Zack Snyder and his fan base. And if you're someone like me, you're going, what does any of that have to do with any of this? Let me try and explain it to the best of my ability. After doing some digging, I found out that a very large section of the Zack Snyder fan base are from India and Southeast Asia, kind of like that general sort of area. Again, I had no idea because I really don't care about the ethnicity of someone's like fan base. I'm not really too concerned with any of that. So for me, it was like, oh, all right. Here's some of the tweets that I saw from Snyder fans explaining why this exact comment is a slight towards Zack Snyder fans in a racist manner. This one's from Jason LeBoy Photo, and he says, he knows Zack has a very large following in India. This was racist and a direct insult to Zack and his fan base. He is the head of a studio. He shouldn't waste his time with online post. Another person says, Snyder has taste and is a fan of Indian culture. That's part of why Indians love him. And then attached is a screenshot of Zack Snyder sharing Hindu art and then claiming that he used it as inspiration for some of his films. So that is sort of where that logical leap started. It's Zack Snyder has a lot of fans from India and Southeast Asia, and then from here, James Gunn is insulting them specifically, which is why he chose India. Here's a post though from someone who tries to kind of break it down in a much more rational sense. Reminder, Gunn said basically that he shouldn't care about someone on the other side of the planet rage baiting him, but he said India, and that means racism, and they've taken this as Gunn is racist. So now it's okay to call everyone who's a fan of him on the same level as Mustache Guy from Germany. Here's a tweet from a friend of the channel, Super Daikaiju Tony, who tweeted out, Snyder fans all of a sudden caring about racism over James Gunn's 12-year-old kid from India comment after months of saying the most insane shit imaginable is laughably ironic. And attached is some of the best of, or rather the worst of, Snyder fans being downright insane. The first one here is them wishing that James Gunn's wife is... yeah, you can read it yourself. The other one is them comparing Superman to a Jewish caricature. It's insane. The other one is talking about how Superman is an immigrant, but not really, because it's a legal immigrant and that the parents of his creators were legal immigrants. It's weird mental gymnastics. And the other one is insanity. I don't want to go over all this, but you get the idea. Now, something that I ended up stumbling upon while researching this video is this insane conspiracy theory that was like multiple posts long, and it's about how James Gunn and Peter Safran and DC as a whole, how they hate India and are using propaganda to target their sovereignty and to break the will of the Indian people. And upon looking more into the account, it is a Zack Snyder fan. But I want to kind of go through this entire thread in detail and just kind of talk about it because it's insane. It's certifiably like it is the schizo has found patterns in the numbers level of like justification for some of these. It's crazy. Here's the first one. DC Studios, currently run by James Gunn and Peter Safran, has been repeatedly targeting India's sovereignty and its citizens throughout their movies, interviews, and fandom. Here's a thread exposing their hateful propaganda against India. In Injustice 2021, Kashmir is depicted as a disputed region. Superman and Wonder Woman destroy Indian military equipment and declare the region as an arms-free zone. The Justice League destroy Indian Air Force FA-18D Hornets armed with AIM-9L Sidewinder infrared IR close combat missiles, CCMs, over Kashmir in the movie. Now, something I should say right off the bat is, I don't think that was specifically mentioned in the movie. I also don't think they understand that Injustice is an Elseworld story, meaning you're gonna have alternate history with this timeline. Like, it would be like saying DC hates America because they made Red Sun, a story where Superman ended up going to the Soviet Union instead of Kansas. Like, no, it's an Elseworld story where there's gonna be geological differences with each instance. And in this, it just so happens that they chose India as being a place where there's a lot of combat going on. Now, I'm not too knowledgeable in this. I'm not gonna claim that I'm an expert in geopolitical debates like this, but from my understanding, Kashmir is a territory that India, Pakistan, and China have all sort of like been fighting over for years, and they'll claim that, oh, we own this chunk of land, and then the other country will say, no, we own this chunk of land, and it's just been a debate that's been ongoing. As of right now, the UN labels it as disputed land. So to me, I don't really see an issue in Injustice using disputed land, Kashmir, as a plot point, because that's what it is. It's disputed land. So of course there would be conflicts there, and of course then in a fictional story, the Justice League would have to step in and stop the fighting. Something else I think is very important to talk about too is how Injustice 2021 was not produced under James Gunn's leadership. At that time, he was still making the Suicide Squad, and I don't think he was yet named as the new head of DC Studios. I think that's complete misinformation to say otherwise, like that is literal fact. Let's continue though. In Watchmen Chapter 1, 2024, the James Gunn and Peter Safran run DC Studios once again targets the sovereignty of India by incorrectly depicting Pakistan-occupied Kashmir as part of Pakistan and Aksani Chin as part of China. Yet again, this is just DC using disputed land as a place to set a story where there will be conflict. That is just storytelling 101. It would be the same thing as setting a story in Israel, because that's currently a very hot topic. There's a lot of conflict that's going on right there, so it would make sense if you want to ground your story in the real world. It just so happens that with this, you kind of get the jackpot of it's 3 countries involved, with it being India, Pakistan, and China. To me, this person just comes off as someone who is from India and is very, very upset that they are not claiming that these occupied territories are Indian. They wish that they were being labeled as being Indian territories, but they just aren't. And that's what they are so upset by. It is a little blip on a map that you see in the background of a scene that most people aren't really going to be paying attention to. The DC fandom has also repeatedly targeting Indians with racist remarks. It's also concerning that several accounts involved in this harassment campaign against Indians allegedly involve bots, most of which speak in favor of DC Studios and its products. To me, this just reads as, there are accounts that are racist towards Indians, which is of course wrong. I'm not trying to get that part twisted. That is wrong and you shouldn't do that. But I don't think that DC Studios is funding a bot farm to be racist specifically towards Indians. I think that is genuinely nuts. I completely disagree with that sentiment. There's no way a company that is gearing up for a film that will be released in India is creating a bot farm that is then racist towards Indians. That makes no sense whatsoever. The thread continues, and then we basically get to see where this person is coming from and what their call to action is. They want Superman 2025 to be banned in India. Why? To hurt its box office. This is a Zack Snyder fan. That's all they care about, is box office and bad reviews. Like, this is a conspiracy theory first and foremost. That's exactly what this is. It's mind-blowing to me. Like, it's so, like, you have to connect a million different dots to try and figure out, yeah, we're gonna restructure country lines and, borders in order to demoralize the people of India. It's like, I don't think they give a shit. I really don't think they care that much. And if they do, I don't know what to tell you, because it's like, it's a cartoon made in a country that isn't your own from 4 years ago, I think it's also important to note that James Gunn himself has said multiple times that he is a big fan of Indian cinema, that dating as far back as the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, he has used them as inspiration for his own work. Some people have said that these claims by him are like damage control, and it's his way of sort of like trying to get the hate to stop, but I completely disagree. This very much seems like someone who actually cares about Indian cinema and has talked about it multiple times, like without the need to like do damage control or anything. I mean, James Gunn himself has been very much a worldly filmmaker in terms of his influences. A big example of this is his love for Japanese cinema, specifically kaiju films. He's talked about how much he loves Ultraman. There's pictures of him and a guy in an Ultraman costume together, which I like to think that that's just the real Ultraman, but we'll go on. He loves Godzilla. I mean, there were talks, from my understanding, that way back when the MonsterVerse was first kind of starting out, that he was one of the directors that was in talks of joining the MonsterVerse as a director. He just seems like someone who cares a lot about movies from around the globe, and I don't think that that's a slight against him or even just a positive. It's just a basic sort of like look at him as a filmmaker. Like, that's immediately clear. Now, alongside the racism allegations, the Snyder fans and general critics have brought up the pedophilia accusations, which I do want to talk about here, since I kind of briefly touched upon them in prior videos, and I feel like now would be a good time to kind of talk about that whole drama, because It is very insane on the surface. It really is. So in case you might not have remembered, or if you forgot, or you weren't even made aware, way back in the day, this was about right before Guardians 3 was about to start filming, or maybe it was in pre-production, James Gunn was canceled on Twitter for having a bunch of offensive tweets. And a lot of them involved, rape jokes, or pedophilia jokes, or racist jokes, what have you. These were edgy and offensive jokes that were made during his Troma era. If you don't know what Troma is a film production company, distribution company that made films like Night of the Poultrygeist, The Toxic Avenger, Tromeo and Juliet, you name it. Their whole brand is making some of the most offensive and disgusting movies imaginable. I mean, if you want an idea of like some Troma alumni, Matt Stone and Trey Parker, the creators of South Park, worked with Troma on their film Cannibal the Musical. Like, that is a studio that is known for pushing boundaries. So it's kind of like, well, yeah, of course he'd make very off-color jokes. Like, that's totally in line for not just him, but that studio as well. Now, as a result of these tweets, Gunn was fired by Disney, but was later rehired after an investigation found no wrongdoing whatsoever. This is stuff from years ago, and it has been addressed publicly by everyone involved, and it seems like everyone involved has just sort of moved on, as this guy had an edgy phase in his life, and then he grew out of it, was fired for it, and then came back and made a great movie. Like, it's over, it's in the past. I think accusing someone of something as serious as pedophilia or even racism is downright dangerous for a multitude of reasons. It dilutes the gravity of those charges when they are brought against someone when it's completely justified. It's literally the boy who cried wolf. If everyone that makes an edgy joke is labeled as being a racist or a pedophile, then when someone who actually is one of those things and is very serious about it, when that is brought to light, you're just going to be written off. Now, let me explain why this type of name calling can be so dangerous, especially in today's age. I made 2 videos. One was called The Godzilla Degenerates, where I talked about a bunch of Godzilla fans that turned out to be pedophiles, and I brought that up in the video. I went kind of case by case. And there were a few comments where it's like, yeah, I mean, there's pedophiles all over, so who really cares? And there were just a lot of dismissive comments towards that, when it's like, no, there's legitimate evidence here that these people are targeting children. And that broke my heart. The other one is a video on Transformers Prime Galvatron's Revenge. It's a fan film that was made where the main actor that played Optimus Prime is a literal neo-Nazi. This guy is a literal Nazi. He had swastikas in the background of his videos. He would do the salute, the one that I'm sure you're all imagining right now. He would say downright horrific stuff about people that were not white. This is someone who literally was a Nazi. And you had people in the comments like, oh, at first when you called him a Nazi, I was kind of skeptical, but now that I saw the evidence, I get it. And it's like, this is what constantly name-calling innocent people, labeling them as these things, this is what it has done to the internet, and it's sad, it really is. There are real cases of racial discrimination and child endangerment, child abuse. These are things that require actual attention. Calling someone a bigot or a pedophile over a milquetoast comment just makes real advocacy even harder. Weaponized outrage like this doesn't help victims, it only harms them in the end. Because like I said, it's the boy who cried wolf. They're not going to believe you for the millionth time if you say, this person's a pedophile, this person's a racist. You need to have actual evidence to back it up. And frankly, I haven't seen any actual evidence beyond tweets taken out of context, jokes taken out of context, and interview clips taken out of context. And I'm not just saying this because I'm defending James Gunn or I'm a Gunbot, which, by the way, Gunbot is like one of the coolest labels ever. It sounds like something out of like 40K. I've also heard hashtag gun control get thrown around, which I think is also like a badass like hashtag. I don't even know who started that, if that was James Gunn fans or like the Snyder fans. I really don't know, but I think it sounds cool. Like with the 2 ends, it's great stuff. I'm someone that just wants a good movie. I want an accurate Superman depiction. I'm someone who's very excited for Superman. Right next to me, in fact, I literally have my copy of All-Star Superman. So it's just one of those things where it's like, I want a great Superman adaptation put to film, and I hope that we get it. If not, I'm not gonna cope and say, oh, it was actually the greatest movie ever and you guys are just too dumb for it. You know, I'm not gonna be a Batman versus Superman fan. What I am gonna do is I'm gonna give my honest opinion like I always do. But I just think it's important to note that this entire controversy is not about racism. It's about Snyder loyalists trying to tear down the new DC Superman. That's what this is. You can dislike the James Gunn version of Superman, even though it's not out yet. You can be upset by the studio politics. You can prefer Zack Snyder's vision. That is all fair game, and I'm more than okay with people enjoying that. In fact, there's a lot that I personally like about Zack Snyder's work, which I will talk about in an upcoming video. But twisting harmless comments into career-ending controversies is just so dangerous. It's not activism, it's manipulation. Like, flat out, that's what it is. I think it's overall wrong to turn petty fandom beef into social justice battles that ultimately benefit no one except for the aggressors in this case.
Ladies and gentlemen, hashtag Henry Cavill Superman! No Henry Cavill Superman, no money, wallets, clothes.
Your DCU is dead on arrival like we've been telling you. 250 million fake views, crap.
The Snyder fan movement collapsed the moment Superman 2025 opened successfully, disproving every prediction they had spent years making. Ever since James Gunn was announced as the new creative lead for DC, Snyder fans positioned themselves as an opposition group, convinced that his version of Superman would fail both critically and financially. They called for boycotts, spammed hashtags like hashtag wallets closed.
Wallets closed.
And of course, the classic hashtag restore the Snyderverse. And they confidently pushed the narrative that mainstream audiences would reject any Superman film that didn't involve Zack Snyder or Henry Cavill. That belief was disproven on July 11th, when Superman 2025 debuted with the largest opening weekend in Superman's entire history. Snyder fans had spent months claiming the film would struggle to crack basic financial targets, but those claims were false. The audience showed up, and what makes this result especially damaging to the Snyder fandom's credibility is that it happened even in markets where they deliberately tried to sabotage the film. India became a specific focus for Snyder fans after James Gunn's old tweets resurfaced, as well as there being out-of-context interview clips where coordinated efforts online attempted to push narratives around banning the film in India. None of that worked. In fact, Superman 2025 opened as the #1 movie in India, posting the biggest opening weekend for any DC film in the country. Snyder fans had made India a key part of their protest strategy, and that strategy failed in the most visible way possible. It's one thing to predict failure and be wrong privately, but it's another to run an organized boycott, only for that boycott to then have no measurable impact whatsoever.
You lose.
This is about showing exactly what the end of the Snyder Cult looks like in real time. So let's start at the beginning of the week. The Snyder fandom's first reaction to Superman's opening numbers was public denial, shown in real time through social media posts. When Variety confirmed the film had earned $22.5 million in previews, Snyder fans did not attempt to analyze or engage with the data. Instead, their response was to claim that the numbers had been falsified. One of the clearest examples came from Twitter user Kal-El7612, who posted, "This is called emotional manipulation from Variety. No way in hell that Dodo Superman can make $22.5 million after the incoming bad and negative reviews all over. Laughing emoji, laughing emoji, laughing emoji, hashtag Superman flop." This tweet does not express confusion or skepticism. Instead, it just shows complete refusal to accept publicly available information. The specific phrase emotional manipulation implies that this dude saw neutral box office reporting as a direct attack on his worldview. This guy's entire identity as a member of a fandom depended on Superman 2025 failing, so when the data conflicted with that expectation, they defaulted to conspiracy theories rather than revising their own beliefs. That initial denial quickly escalated into outright financial predictions that ignored real-time box office updates, even as global reports continued to show strong numbers. Snyder fans began posting absolute statements about the film's supposed failure.
It doesn't make sense, but what does make sense is that James Gunn pocketed that money for him and his buddies and his wife and those shills on YouTube. That's where that money went. That makes more logical sense.
Once denial over Superman's box office numbers collapsed, you also had Snyder fans that shifted into accusing critics and audiences of being paid shills. I myself was called a paid shill because I liked the new Superman movie. And to them it was like, yeah, WB's paying you. It's like, no, I liked the movie. I thought it was fun. If audiences enjoyed James Gunn's Superman, it had to be because Warner Brothers was secretly paying people to say good things about it. And not that people just liked the movie. Snyder Bros did not present evidence for this belief beyond a press invite that circulated on Twitter, which showed basic language encouraging social media posts. Twitter user Hayden Barton _39 posted, "We're not paid to leave good reviews. Yeah, no shit, this is what we mean. Hashtag Superman movie." The attached image read, "Social posts are not required but greatly appreciated as they help us prioritize you for future opportunities." This is just standard phrasing used across the film industry for press screenings and influencer events. It really doesn't promise any payment or push them to say good things. It doesn't instruct reviewers on what opinions to express. But of course, Snyder fans, being media illiterate, interpreted it as being direct evidence of fraud because they needed a reason to dismiss the overwhelmingly positive reception that Superman was receiving. Rather than just accept that the film had connected with audiences and critics on its own merit, they defaulted to accusing the entire system of corruption. As the opening weekend continued, Snyder fans escalated from shill accusations to outright moving the goalposts. By Sunday afternoon, they stopped arguing that Superman was a flop and started nitpicking specific figures. One example came from Twitter user Prime_76, who posted, "Y'all still love lying on your own IPs. Man of Steel globally made $225 million in 24 markets first weekend. Superman globally made $217 in 78 markets." This argument deliberately ignores key variables like the number of markets, ticket price inflation, the fact that this is a post-COVID environment, and the simple fact that opening weekend totals do not define long-term success. The point was not to make an honest comparison, but just to keep the illusion alive that Man of Steel had somehow outperformed Superman 2025, even as every available data point showed otherwise. The fandom's behavior then started shifting from denial into outright performative cult behavior. At that point, all these posts were about creating public displays of loyalty to Zack Snyder's vision of Superman, no matter how disconnected those displays were from reality. One clear example came from this Twitter user who posted, "Little man watching the real Superman with daddy." That post included a photo of a young child sitting in front of a TV watching Man of Steel. Another user and friend of the channel, Super Daikaiju Tony, responded with, "Isn't this like indoctrination?" This is a very weird and darker pattern that I've seen across the Snyder fandom, where parents and older fans would stage photos or videos of their children watching Snyder's Superman films as a symbolic protest against James Gunn's version. They are outright using their own children as props for internet clout. They are trying to reinforce loyalty to a specific film franchise as if it were a political movement. And at this stage, the Snyder fandom no longer resembled a group of film fans, but instead this weird ideological circle where public displays mattered more than actual outcomes. Literally putting your own children out on the internet as ammunition for culture war nonsense. That same mindset carried over into larger scale stunts, such as the "While It's Closed" campaign pushed by accounts like the Lethal Geeks. Leading up to Superman's release, Lethal Geeks repeatedly posted about refusing to support the film financially, positioning themselves as the vanguard of the Snyderverse protest. Their unhinged tweets read things like, "Real fans, real people, not bots, hashtag Henry Cavill Superman, hashtag While It Closed, hashtag Restore the Snyderverse." The Lethal Geeks also organized a physical in-person protest, renting out a truck with an LED billboard attached to it displaying Snyderverse-related slogans. I'm not joking.
So, right here we're with Marcus Neil Sevens, member of the community.
That's right. Snyderverse, baby.
Yeah, baby. So what you think about this beautiful little truck that we pulled for the people?
Support is love for the Snyderverse fans, for the Snyderverse in general, and for Zack. And listen, we're out here fighting. We're out here trying to get it back.
Exactly. Christopher McQuarrie. We could have had Christopher McQuarrie.
Like, think about this for a second. This dude's literally paying thousands of dollars to try and sway public opinion through visible street-level marketing, and none of it worked. He just got laughed at on the internet. That truck billboard didn't impact sales, and if anything, it only reinforced how disconnected the Snyder fandom had become from reality.
Ladies and gentlemen, hashtag Henry Cavill Superman!
Another account I want to talk about is Snyder King. Their handle is BO086432. And I'm saying this flat out, I don't know if this is even a real person or not. I've watched this account post hundreds of times a day, every single day for months. It's always the same pattern of quote tweeting Superman box office updates, replying under random film news accounts, and pushing the same recycled Snyder worship and the same recycled James Gunn hate. You don't post like that unless it's automated or unless you've fully lost your grip on reality. The handle alone kind of gives it away. It's random letters and numbers, and that's bot account 101. Real people don't choose usernames like that. Snyder King doesn't behave like a fan account either. It's really just pure engagement bait as a way of, like, I'm assuming generating money. But what I want to know is, who is running this account? Who benefits from keeping a dead conversation like this alive? I pulled the analytics. Between July 9th and July 11th, Snyder King posted over 200 times. 93% of it was just replying to people with no original content. Total impressions were 38,000, and the economic value attached to all of this was $44. All of this spamming and rage baiting for just $44. To me, that's where either one of two possibilities land. Either this is a bot that's set up by some cheap engagement farm, or it is a real person who genuinely believes that this is worth their time, sacrificing entire days of their life for $44 worth of imaginary influence. Neither option is good, and if this is a real person, I actually hope they get the help that they need. When you look at the post history, there are gaps. You can see clear lulls in posting. 2, 3, sometimes 4-hour stretches where there's nothing. Bots don't sleep, right? Like, a human will have lulls like that. This is very clearly human behavior, which means this is probably a real person. Someone is really wasting their life away, spamming the same delusional Zack Snyder takes and screaming into the void. At that point, I don't even know what to say. Like, that's tragic. It really is. Following the 2025 Superman opening weekend, the behavior of the Snyder Bros moved beyond just denial and right into outright hostility, racism, and downright abhorrent behavior. When the box office numbers became impossible to dismiss, Snyder fans did not scale back their protests, but instead chose to just straight up harass people, send personal attacks, and be openly racist. This is a fandom that positioned themselves as being this persecuted, misunderstood group. But these types of messages reveal that in reality, they embodied the exact toxic behavior that made Zack Snyder's brand of superhero films so polarizing in the first place. And that same attitude surfaced in public comment sections. One public post from the account Overseer Terry perfectly summarized the irrational mindset spreading across Snyder fan spaces. It reads, "Curse whoever gave this a good rating. This is just blind hostility aimed at strangers for enjoying a movie." Think about that for a second. This is where we're at right now. We are seeing what was once a fan movement of people who wanted to see a director's vision come to life slowly morph into a reactionary subculture that is defined entirely by resentment and nothing more. You had tweets like this, where it says, how Zack Snyder portrayed female characters versus how James Gunn did. The tweet includes a still image of Wonder Woman from Zack Snyder's films, next to a clip of Hawkgirl from Superman 2025 using her sonic scream powers. There's no context or any genuine analysis. Instead, we're just seeing a weird attempt to imply that James Gunn's versions of superheroes were inferior because it didn't match Zack Snyder's aura and hype moment type of filmmaking. If anything, it actually shows how they just prefer to reframe conversations around aesthetics instead of actual substance. Like, if a character doesn't look like Henry Cavill and they're not flexing in slow motion, then it's not a real movie. At this point, there just isn't much left to say about the Snyder fandom that hasn't already been documented by me or other channels on YouTube. What started out as a very loud and aggressive online movement has burned itself out in public. The boycotts failed, the embarrassing conspiracy theories collapsed, and all that's left is a handful of bitter posts and recycled hashtags.
Hashtag Henry Cavill Superman!
As a result, this is going to be my last video about the Snyder Bro fandom for the foreseeable future. Not because they disappeared completely, but because continuing to cover them feels pointless now. There's nothing new happening, it's just the same people running in circles repeating the same talking points to a rapidly shrinking audience. Unless something completely unhinged happens, something that is worth actually breaking down, I'm done giving this corner of the internet any more oxygen. They had their moment, they lost, and now all that's left is silence. And with all that out of the way, I'm Cole McCormick. You are watching Firewood Media. Huge thanks to our channel members. Your support makes these videos possible. Your names are listed right here up on screen. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.